You remember the smell of a Blockbuster on a Friday night. You remember the specific weight of a Nokia 3310 in your pocket, the way the T9 keyboard made you think in compressed syllables. You remember AM away messages as a form of poetry, the exact dial-up screech that meant the internet was happening, the specific fluorescent anxiety of a mall food court on a Saturday afternoon. You remember TRL. You remember burning CDs with 30-second gaps between tracks because the software defaulted that way and you didn't know how to change it. You remember Tamagotchis dying in your backpack during third period. You remember when Google was a verb people were still getting used to. You remember being handed a digital camera at a birthday party in the photos taking 3 weeks to exist. You remember the exact version of yourself that existed before you had a phone that went everywhere with you, and you remember the version that came after. And those two people do not feel entirely like the same person. And then, you remember September 11th. You were 16, old enough to understand it completely, young enough that it rewired something. The world that existed when you woke up that morning was not the world that existed by the time you went to sleep, and you absorbed that fact in a specific way, in the way that a teenager absorbs enormous things, which is to say, into the body, into the nervous system, into the unconscious architecture of how you understand safety, impermanence, and the solidity of the world beneath your feet. That is where this starts. You have probably looked up your birth year in a generational chart at some point. You found 1985 listed as millennial. Technically, definitionally, unambiguously millennial, and something in you pushed back, not loudly, not with certainty, just a quiet interior friction, a sense that the description didn't fully land, like a key that fits the lock but doesn't quite turn. You know what millennials are described as. You have read the think pieces, entitled, trophy generation, avocado toast, participation medals. You felt distant from that characterization, not because you were better, but because it doesn't match the texture of your actual interior experience. At the same time, when someone calls you Gen X, cynical, slacker, latchkey, grunge, that doesn't fully fit either. Gen X had their formation years in the 80s, their adolescence in a pre-digital world. They watched the internet arrive as adults. That is a categorically different psychological event than growing up alongside it. You exist in the gap. You are not quite either. You are something the chart doesn't have a clean column for. And that absence is not a small thing, because generational identity is not just trivia, it is a shorthand for a specific set of formative pressures, and when the shorthand doesn't fit, it leaves you without language for the actual set of pressures that shaped you. Here is what that actually built. But first, here is what it actually felt like. You grew up in two worlds simultaneously, and that is not a metaphor, it is a literal description of your developmental timeline. You had a childhood that was largely analog, physical, local, bored in productive ways, navigating social life without documentation, making mistakes that did not persist, existing in an unrecorded present. And then, during adolescence and early adulthood, the digital world arrived and you migrated into it. Not as a native, not as a tourist, as something in between. You code switched, you learned both languages, you built fluency in both registers, and you did it during the specific window of development when identity formation is already at its most unstable. Psychologist Jeffrey Arnett, who coined the term emerging adulthood in his landmark 2000 paper in American Psychologist, identified the years between roughly 18 and 25 as a distinct developmental phase, characterized by identity exploration, instability, in a sense of being in between, neither adolescent nor fully adult. You hit that window precisely as the internet was scaling into a mass social phenomenon. Facebook launched in 2004 when you were 19, YouTube in 2005, Twitter in 2006, the iPhone in 2007. You were not a child encountering these things. You were in the most psychologically unstable, identity-forming period of your life, and these tools arrived and restructured the social world mid-formation. That is not what happened to Gen X, and it's not what happened to younger millennials who were children when the smartphone arrived. It happened to you. Specifically, your formation was disrupted mid-sentence. Here is what psychologists call what happened to you. Karl Mannheim, the Hungarian sociologist whose 1923 essay, The Problem of Generations, remains the foundation text on generational theory,
argued that a generation is not defined by birth year, it's defined by the historical events that occurred during the specific window that a cohort is most susceptible to formative influence, roughly between the ages of 12 and 25. He called this the generational location, the intersection of age and event that creates a shared psychological imprint. By Mannheim's definition, your generational location is not cleanly millennial and not cleanly Gen X. You are what he would call a generational unit, a subgroup within a broader cohort that experienced the same historical events but processed them through a different developmental lens. What that means is this: you are not mislabeled, you are underlabeled. The generational framework wasn't built enough with resolution to see you, and psychology has something specific to say about that. The experience of occupying an in-between identity, of belonging fully to neither group, of being legible to multiple categories but claimed completely by none, has a name. Psychologists call it marginal identity, a concept developed by sociologist Robert Park in the early 20th century, and later refined by Everett Stonequist in his work The Marginal Man. Stonequist described the marginal person as someone who lives simultaneously in two social worlds without being fully incorporated into either. The original research focused on immigration and cultural transition, but the underlying psychology maps precisely onto what you experienced, a kind of cultural bilingualism that comes with real cognitive and emotional costs.
The cost is this: you are fluent in two registers, and fluency is not the same as belonging. You can speak the language of analog nostalgia with older colleagues who remember the pre-digital world as adults. You can speak the language of digital nativity with younger colleagues who have never known anything else. You translate constantly. You are always code switching, always finding the right register for the room, always aware that you are not quite the same as the people on either side of you. That is exhausting. And it is probably felt for a long time like a personal inadequacy rather than a structural condition, like you were just bad at finding your people, like you were too nostalgic to be current, too current to be nostalgic, like you didn't fit and the lack of fit was about you. It was not about you, it was about the gap. You just happened to be born inside it. But the more consequential piece, the piece that actually matters for understanding who you became, is what that in-between position built in you. Because Stonequist wasn't simply describing a burden, he was describing the origin of a specific capacity. He wrote that the marginal individual, precisely because of their position on the boundary between worlds, develops a heightened capacity for critical awareness, an ability to see both worlds more clearly than those fully embedded in either. The outsider perspective, the double consciousness, the constant translation work, these are not just costs, they are also a form of training. You learn to read rooms quickly, not as a social skill you practiced, as a survival adaptation you developed. When you never quite know which version of the cultural script applies to you, you become very good at reading which version applies to the room you are currently in. You became, over years of unconscious practice, a calibrator, a reader of context, a person who can walk into a situation and quickly assess what it requires and what register will be understood. That is not a small thing. That is, in professional and relational terms, an enormously sophisticated capacity, and you probably undervalue it because you didn't have to try to develop it. It just happened. The things that happen without trying feel less like skills and more like facts of personality, so they go unrecognized as the developed competencies they actually are. Here is the thing that needs to be said about the specific historical location you occupied. You came of age in a period of compounding disruption, and disruption is the right word, not change, because change implies continuity with the direction, while disruption implies breaks. You finished high school into the post-9/11 world. You entered college during the early internet era's most destabilizing phase. You entered the workforce during or immediately before the 2008 financial crisis, which fundamentally restructured the economic landscape for everyone who was trying to build their adult life during that exact window. The things you were told to expect, a stable career, linear progress, institutions that would hold, did not materialize in the way the script predicted.
Research published by Ulrich Boser in the Journal of Vocational Behavior in 2009 identified the cohort that entered the job market between 2008 and 2012 as experiencing what economists call scarring effects, wage and career penalties that persist for a decade or more beyond the initial disruption. But the scarring for your cohort was not just economic, it was epistemological. You watched the institutions that were supposed to be reliable, financial systems, media systems, political systems, demonstrate that they were not reliable. And you watched this happen at exactly the age when you were deciding how much to trust them. You decided not to trust them completely, not from cynicism, from evidence. And here's what that produced. Research by Angela Duckworth at the University of Pennsylvania, published in her 2016 book, Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance, and in her earlier peer-reviewed work with Martin Seligman, identifies a specific pattern in individuals who develop high-functioning adaptability, the capacity to respond effectively to changing and unpredictable conditions. The pattern is not a personality trait you were born with. It is a capacity that is developed specifically through exposure to managed adversity during formative developmental windows, the exact developmental windows you occupied, the kind of adversity that requires you to recalibrate expectations, abandon linear narratives, and build a more flexible model of how the world works. You did not choose this, but you built it. In the thing that was built, the capacity to hold uncertainty without it becoming paralysis, to adapt to new conditions quickly, to function effectively in environments that keep changing the rules, is not just a personal characteristic, it is a cognitive infrastructure. It is the ecological equivalent of having been trained for a specific kind of terrain. The terrain of the 21st century. There is something else that needs to be named because it lives in you and it probably has no name yet. It is the experience of being old enough to remember a world before something existed and young enough to have integrated that something completely. Not the nostalgia itself, that is not the interesting part. The interesting part is the dual consciousness it creates. You remember what it felt like to be bored in a particular way, the specific generative boredom of a Sunday afternoon when there was nothing to do, and so you made something from nothing. Or you sat with your own thoughts long enough that they became interesting. You remember that boredom clearly. You can access it as a sensory memory, as a body memory.
And you also know, with equal clarity, how to live in the world as it is now. The constant connectivity, the ambient information, the social performance of an online presence, the particular anxiety of a notification you haven't checked. You live in that world with full fluency. You are not dragged into it reluctantly the way older generations sometimes were. You moved into it because that's where everything was going, and you adapted. The dual consciousness, remembering both, being fluent in both, belonging fully to neither, is not just a personal quirk. Psychologist Sherry Turkle of MIT, in her 2011 book, Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other, identified this exact position, which she called the always-on generation with a before, as a critically important but understudied perspective. The people who remember before and after, she argued, are the only ones who can see both states clearly. The generation that had no before cannot compare. The generation whose before was their entire adult life sees the present through the lens of loss. You, specifically, can see both, and that comparative vision is not a side effect of your position, it is the central cognitive gift of it. Here's what that dual consciousness taught you about people, because this is where the psychology gets specific in ways that are worth naming directly. When you grew up in an unrecorded social world, you learned to navigate relationships without a permanent record. Mistakes were made, embarrassments happened, conflicts arose, and then they were gone. The social world reset. There was no thread, there was no archive, there was no way to go back and find the version of you that said the wrong thing at the wrong party in 1999. That version of you was only accessible through memory, and memory is imperfect, and imperfect memory is forgiving by nature. And then the permanent record arrived, and you adapted to it because you had to, because everyone did. But you carry something that younger people don't, an embodied knowledge that the permanent record is not the person. You know from before it existed that people are more than their documented moments. You know that the record is a selection, not a summary. You are, by formative experience, more sophisticated about the gap between a person's documented presence in their actual interior life, because you lived through the construction of your own documentation. You remember building it. You remember choosing what to include and what to leave out. You remember that the leaving out was as significant as the including. That knowledge makes you a different kind of listener, a different kind of friend, a different kind of colleague, more tolerant of complexity, more aware that the story someone presents is not the whole story, more capable of holding people with generosity, because you know from the inside that every presented version of a person is a partial version. You probably underestimate how rare this is. The capacity to hold complexity, to resist the compression of a person or a situation into a simple category, is not common. It is not taught. It is built through specific experience. The specific experience of living through the construction of a public self and knowing from the inside that it was constructed, of being old enough to remember what was left out. Psychologist Dan McAdams, whose work on narrative identity at Northwestern University has produced some of the most important research on how people construct their sense of self, has argued that the people who integrate disruption most successfully into their narrative identity are the ones who develop what he calls redemptive sequences, the capacity to find meaning in difficulty without erasing the difficulty, not toxic positivity, not reframing as denial, a genuine integration of the hard thing in the resource it produced. Your disruptions, the generational gap, the technological transition mid-formation, the economic scarring, the institutional disillusionment were not minor. They were the kind of disruptions that leave marks, and the marks are real. But so is what was built, and what was built is not separate from the disruption. It grew directly out of it. The adaptability is the scar tissue. The dual fluency is the scar tissue. The capacity for complexity is the scar tissue. And scar tissue, as anyone who has studied it knows, is not weaker than what it replaces. It is denser. It is more resistant. It is the thing that forms in response to damage, and it holds. There is one more thing. It lives in a quieter place, and it is harder to name, but it needs to be named because you feel it. It is the experience of watching your own cohort get misread repeatedly by the media, by employers, by the cultural frameworks that are supposed to make sense of you. Being called entitled when the actual experience was chronic overqualification and underemployment. Being called avocado toast careless when the actual experience was navigating a housing market that had structurally changed between the time your parents' model was built and the time you arrived. Being given generational advice calibrated for a version of the world that no longer existed when you showed up. Being handed a map for territory that had already changed shape. The repeated experience of being misread, of watching a simplified version of you circulate publicly while the actual interior experience goes unnamed, has a psychological effect. It creates a kind of double exposure. You hold the cultural narrative about your cohort, and you hold your own experience, and they don't align, and you have had to live inside that misalignment without external validation that the misalignment is real. It is real. The misalignment is real. The map was wrong. The experience was different from the label. And the psychological work of holding your own experience against a dominant narrative that describes you incorrectly without either capitulating to the narrative or exhausting yourself fighting it is quiet, daily, invisible work, and it is the kind of work that builds interior stability. Not the stability of certainty, but the stability of someone who has learned to trust their own read of reality when the official read says otherwise. That is a specific kind of groundedness. It doesn't look like confidence from the outside. It looks like skepticism. It looks like a slight delay before accepting someone else's framing. It looks like the habit of checking your own experience before accepting a conclusion handed to you. And in a world that is producing information faster than any of us can verify, that habit, the habit of pausing, of checking, of trusting your own read, is not a personal quirk. It is a critical faculty. It is, in the most literal sense, a form of intelligence.
Here's what needs to be said directly, without qualification. You are not the victim of your timing. You are the product of it. The gap you were born into, technically millennial, psychologically somewhere else, claimed by neither side with full accuracy, was not a misfortune. It was a specific developmental terrain. And what you built in response to that terrain is not incidental to who you are. It is central to who you are. You are the person who remembers both worlds and belongs fully to neither, which means you can see both worlds more clearly than the people who belong to one. You are the person who was formed during compounding disruption, which means your model of stability was never built on the assumption that the ground would hold still, and so when the ground moves, you are not starting from zero. You are the person who was handed the wrong map repeatedly and learned to navigate by terrain instead. That is not a consolation prize for the disruption. That is the actual competency. The map reading is for people who trust the map. The terrain reading is for people who know the map is always partial. You know the map is always partial. You have known that for a long time. You knew it before you had language for it, before it was confirmed by anyone external, before there was a psychological framework to put around it. You knew it from experience. And experience, it turns out, is the most durable form of knowing there is. You are not between generations. You are the fulcrum point, the specific hinge where one era ended and another began, experienced in real time, in the body, during the years when experience becomes identity. That position was hard. It was genuinely hard. The hardness is not erased by what it produced, but what it produced is real. Adaptability, dual fluency, tolerance for ambiguity, the capacity for complexity, a calibrated skepticism that is not cynicism, an interior stability that doesn't come from certainty, but from the learned knowledge that you can hold uncertainty and keep moving. You built all of that, not despite the gap, inside it. If this finally named something you have been carrying, the next video goes into a specific part of this generation's psychology that almost nobody has addressed directly, the long-term emotional cost of chronic overqualification, what the research actually says about it, and what it does to a person's relationship with ambition over time. Subscribe so you don't miss it.